Nun Beis Amud Aleph. This is what we're going to do. We're going to finish up the Gemara that talks about a person from Israel traveling to Chutz La'aretz and wants to do malacha, wants to do work. We're going to go through the rest of the Gemaras, and we're going to go through the Gemaras about Shvius and this whole idea of beer, a little bit complicated, just because it's not something which is so relevant to us. And I'm going to ask you to remind me when we finish the Gemaras. Hopefully, I'll have time to come back to some practical halachos about a person from Israel traveling to America, outside of Israel, what the halachos are, because we spoke about it briefly yesterday. So hopefully, enough time to speak about it practically. If I forget, just all of you are responsible for reminding me. Okay, great. 52A1, second column, third paragraph. So Rav Nassan bar Asya Azlami Bei Rav LePampadisa B'Yom Tov Shini Shel Atzer. So Rav Nassan bar Asya, who was traveling from the rabbinical academy, meaning he was living in Israel. He was a ben Eretz Yisrael. He lived in Eretz Yisrael, and he traveled to Pampadisa, i.e. Bavel, on the second day of Yom Tov. Okay, so he comes all of a sudden, shows up with his luggage on the second day of Yom Tov, right? Shamter Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef lived in Bavel, excommunicated him. Okay, this rabbi, this scholar is traveling from Israel. What are you doing? Traveling? You're coming here with a horse and whatever, and your luggage on Yom Tov. So even though you live in Israel, even though you plan on going back to Israel, you can't show up in Pumpadisa, in Bavel, on Yom Tov. He excommunicates him. Again, so you see clearly, this is not just like, don't do it. This was a big deal, right? Again, remind me, we're going to talk about some practical halachos. Amalei Abaye. Now Abaye says to him, Ulanagde mar negide. Okay, instead of excommunicating him, why don't you give him lashes? So Amar Le, Rav Yosef said to Abaye, Adifa Avdile. I gave him the more severe punishments. Okay, he says, I had two choices. I could have given him lashes, I could have excommunicated him. Excommunication is actually the more severe one, and because doing malacha in Chutz La'aretz on the second day of Yom Tov is so much more severe, therefore I gave him the more severe punishment. Now he shows, how do I know that excommunication is more severe than lashes? In Eretz Yisrael, they would vote to impose lashes on a yeshiva student who sins in a rabbinic area. So if you have a rabbinic student who transgresses a rabbinic law, they would punish them severely because they're supposed to be representative, of Torah. And here you have some person doing it, and they would vote, and the punishment would be lashes. And they would not vote to excommunicate. In other words, clearly the fact that they voted on lashes and not excommunication indicates the lashes was less severe. She says this is not that. That is, when he says that's a situation where someone does something bad, they are in violation of rabbinic law, but this is a really big deal, and therefore I wanted to give them more severe punishments, and therefore he goes ahead and excommunicates and doesn't just give him lashes. There's another version of the story, which is a little different. Nagir of Yosef, the story was not that Rav Yosef excommunicated him, rather Rav Yosef actually gave him lashes. Amalei Abaye says now the opposite. Nisham Temar, one excommunicate him. Derav Shmuel Darmi Tarvayu Mendanid Al Shnei Yom Tov Shel Galios, because we have a teaching from Rav and Shmuel who says that we do excommunicate a person for desecrating the second day of Yom Tov. Okay, some people want to say, second day Yom Tov, it's no big deal, it's not really Yom Tov. Sometimes people are like, we know the real Yom Tov, right? I may as well go ahead and do whatever I want. So Rav and Shmuel would excommunicate people for doing so. Amar Le, he responds, Rav Yosef Tabaye, Hani Mili Inish Alma. That's only for an ordinary person. But since he is a student, since he is a rabbinic student, Detavale Avde, I did the better thing. Here the version's like really flipped. He was a rabbinic student, so he knows better. He made a mistake, and therefore I'm going to be a little bit more lenient for him. How do I know that? And therefore, we know that in Eretz Yisrael they would vote to impose lashes. They would not give excommunication. They would not excommunicate. So you see from here that when it comes to a student, you give him the lower punishment, the lesser punishment, because he knows better. He just made a mistake, and therefore he's saying, really, I should have maybe excommunicated him. If he was someone else, I would excommunicate. But for him, because he's a student, I'm only going to go ahead and give him lashes. Okay, one way or another, lashes or excommunication. The bottom line is we see very clearly that a person from Eretz Yisrael traveling to Chutz La'aretz cannot do malacha on Yom Tov. And again, we'll talk about this a little bit more. Now let's go into the last part of our Mishnah. The Mishnah spoke about a person. Remember, there's the idea of biur. And what that means is that that you're allowed to take crops on the seventh year, living in Israel. It's allowed to take crops. Of course, it's relevant to us outside of Israel. Very, very important. This was a big challenge as Baruch Hashem. There's a lot of exports from Israel. And any Perush Shvius are really, we cannot eat. And I think Trader Joe's, a couple of stores were selling Perush Shvius, so it is relevant. But one of the important halachos, if you're more for people living in Israel, was that you'd be allowed to take crops from the field to feed your animals, but when there's nothing left in the fields, then you have to, according to many, destroy that you took into the house, because you have to destroy that's in the house. According to some, you have to take it outside and be mafkir. One way or another, that's the halacha biur, that you're allowed to take a little bit extra for your animals until the food in the fields runs out. meaning when the wild animals have no extra, free, loose food to go and gather, then you have to do beer. You have to get rid of the food that's in your house. Okay, and the Mishnah spoke about a person who travels from one place where the fruits. Where there is no more produce to a place where there is produce, or from a place where there is produce to a place where there's no more produce, and said that you have to take on the stringencies of both places, i.e., in both cases you have to do beer, okay? And then Rabbi Yehuda said a bit of a cryptic statement. Rabbi Yehuda said, at the end of the Mishnah, go out and bring for yourself. And we don't really know what Rabbi Yehuda said, go out and bring for yourself, and we'll see a couple of different possible explanations. So ask the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda had it not. When Rabbi Yehuda says go out and bring for yourself, does he not hold of the following Mishnah that says, okay, so the Gemara assumes at this point that Rabbi Yehuda is actually being lenient. Rabbi Yehuda is actually saying that even though he came from a place where they ran out, since he's in a place where they didn't run out, he's allowed to enjoy, the opposite. Since he came from a place where they did not run out, and he goes to a place where they did run out, he could still go on the leniency of the place that he came from. And the Gemara asks, wait a second, how can Rabbi Yehuda argue on this general principle that says you take on the stringencies of both places? The Gemara is not willing to assume that Rabbi Yehuda argues with that general principle that you have to take on the stringencies of the place that you travel to, and yet Rabbi Yehuda over here seems to be saying that since I came from a place where they didn't run out of fruit, I'm allowed to still have my fruit stockpiled. And the Gemara says, how could that be? We have this principle. You have to take on the stringencies of the place that you travel to. So we're going to see a couple of possible explanations as to what he meant. Amrav Shisha B'Rei Rav Idi Milsa Achri Rav Yehuda. One explanation of Yehuda is actually saying something totally different. Omi makom shelo kalu lemakom shelo kalu. We're not talking about the simple case of the Mishnah. Rather, we're talking about a person who comes from place number 1 where they ran out of fruit, and he goes to produce, and he goes to place number 2 where they also don't have the produce. Vishama shekal bimkomo. Sorry. What did I say? Let me just say again. Guy travels from point A where they still have produce. They did not run out of produce. Travels to place B where they also did not run out of produce. Then he hears that in his original hometown, now that after he's traveled, they ran out of produce. So Chayv Levayer, the Tanakama is saying, in such a case, even though when the person left, there still was produce in his hometown, but now that he hears that the place that he came from ran out of produce, now he has to get rid of his produce. Okay? Slightly different than the simple case of our Mishnah. And to that, Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda says, no, I don't have to get rid of the produce since when I go and bring for myself from the place from this place, meaning Rabbi Yehuda could say, listen, but now I'm here, and when I got here, when I left my place, I was fine. When I come to this place, I'm fine, and I'm still fine. Why would I have to get rid of the produce just because in my own hometown now they ran out of produce? Rabbi Yehuda is saying, no, since in my place right now there is produce, I'm allowed to keep my produce. Okay? Says the Gemara. That would mean the Rabbi Yehuda is coming to say a leniency. In other words, Tanakama is saying that since now you learn that in your hometown the produce is over, you have to get rid of it. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, I don't have to get rid of it. Since when I left it was okay, and now in this place it's okay, therefore I could keep it. That means Rabbi Yehuda is coming to say a leniency. Rabbi Lazar said about our Mishnah, that Rabbi Yehuda was coming to say a stringency. And therefore, this approach by Rav Shisha B'Rei Rav Idi cannot be true. Let's say the opposite. Rather, what is happening is the Tanakama saying, if you go from your hometown and there's produce, and you come to a new town and there's produce, and then you hear that your hometown runs out, the Tanakama is saying you don't have to get rid of it. Tanakama is saying a leniency, you don't have to get rid of it. And to that, Rabbi Yehuda Omer tzeva avelecha af atam heicha daitinu. Okay, so we say he is obligated to get rid of his crops because the people, and the statement of Rabbi Yehuda now is actually coming from the people in his hometown. They're saying to him, go and bring produce from your hometown. Is there produce in the hometown? No. And therefore, basically saying, since you can't get produce from where you came, therefore you have to get rid of it. Okay, v'hakaluhu, and since the produce has run out, therefore you also have to get rid of it. Okay, that is approach number 1. Abaye gives a second approach. Olam Keitani, keep the Mishnah as it was stated initially. This is what the Mishnah it means to say. Omi makam shelo kalu, lemakam shekalu. Okay, so the person goes from a place where the produce still is in existence. Point number A, their hometown has produce. And they travel to point number B, where there is no produce. And then he goes back to his hometown, right? So basically, a guy comes from his hometown, there's still a ton of produce in the fields. He goes to a new town, no produce. And then he goes back to his hometown, where there still is produce, right? And to that, the Tanakama says, you don't have to get rid of them. You don't have to get rid of it because your hometown has the food, and you're back in your hometown now. You don't have to get rid of it. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, no. We say to this person, you have to go and get food from the place that you're coming from, meaning the town that you visited, you have to go and get produce from there, and we know the place that he visited has no produce, and therefore, they ran out, and therefore, even though you came back to your hometown, you have to get rid of your produce. Rashi asks, I understand, Rabbi Yehuda, is it on the back of the donkey that absorbs them as the town's crops? In other words, he's saying, why would we obligate the person for the fact that he once was in this other town? Is it the donkey that, is the traveling of the donkey what causes the obligation for Shvius? In other words, he's asking in a bit of a funny way, but basically saying the obligation is about the produce on the lands, right? The fact that your donkey brought the produce into that place, that's what triggers an obligation. It's nothing to do with you traveling. It's not about the donkey. He's saying the point is your traveling is not what triggers it. It's where you are. And therefore Rav Ashi says this doesn't make any sense. How could Rav Yehuda say that since at one point I stopped in a town which didn't have produce, therefore I have to get rid of my produce? That makes no sense. Therefore, Elam Rav Ashi biplugged on tonight. Rather, they're arguing about the following disputes. It's not as taught in the Mishnah. Hakove shlosha kvashim. We're now at 52a3. Hakove shlosha kvashim bechavetz achas. A person who preserves three kinds of vegetables in one barrel. So a person has a barrel and they take three different types of vegetables. They put them in that barrel to preserve them. Right? You're making like pickles and tomato, whatever, tomatoes and peppers. You put them all in the same barrel. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Ochlan al Rishon. Rabbi Eliezer says that as long as the first one is still available, you're able to eat all three of them as long as the first one's still available. Now, the svara behind that is that if you put them all to be absorbed, if you put them all in one barrel, then Rabbi Eliezer is saying they basically become all like one entity, right? Because the flavor of all of them gets kind of subsumed. If you go ahead and I don't know if you ever made pickles or not that I have, but whatever. The point is that the vegetables get all the juices and flavor, etc., gets extracted and gets mixed into other things. And then Rabbi Eliezer says that even though the tomatoes and the peppers are no longer are all depleted, but since the cucumbers are not depleted, and now all of them they're not just. The tomato's no longer a tomato, it's a tomato cucumber. And the pepper's no longer pepper, it's a pepper cucumber. And since there still are cucumbers in the fields, we wait until all the cucumbers on the field are done. And until that point, you're allowed to eat the tomato cucumber and the pepper cucumber because it really is a cucumber to some degree. Okay? Rabbi Yeshua Omer, Afala Achron. Sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. Rabbi Eliezer says the opposite. Rabbi Eliezer says no. I was explaining Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Eliezer says that no. Bottom line is that it's the opposite. That as long as cucumbers are gone, as long as one of these species are gone, as long as tomatoes are gone, since they all have a little bit of flavored tomato in it, you have to stop eating tomato. Okay? And then Rabbi Yeshua says the opposite. Rabbi Shimon Afal Achron, he says the opposite. Since they all have a flavor of cucumber and they're still cucumbers, you could still wait, right? Same idea, but flipped. No, you look at each one. I don't care, it has a little bit of flavor. Are there tomatoes left? You can eat tomatoes. Are there cucumbers? You can eat cucumbers. Okay? And basically what he's suggesting is that the Tanna Kama holds like Rabbi Yeshua, okay, who is the more lenient view, and Rabbi Yehuda holds like Rabbi Gamliel, who says, no, we look at each vegetable. And that's what Yehuda was saying. He says, go and look in the field. What he was saying is that, are there tomatoes? Then eat tomatoes. If there are no tomatoes, then eat tomatoes. And that's what Yehuda was saying. And the halacha follows the view of Rabbi Gamliel. Okay, that's another way of interpreting the machlokas in our Mishnah. Ravina, our third, last approach, biplug tani tonight, they're arguing about the following machlokas. It's not as taught in Mishnah. Ochle mitzmarim, ad sheyichla achron shebitzoar. Okay, so you're allowed to eat dates in the lands of Yehuda. Okay, the Eretz Yisrael is divided, historically into three different parts. There is like the south, the north, and the Transjordan. Okay, so basically Yehuda is one region. Okay, Judah, we call Judah's Miriam. It's one region, and what the Tanna Kama over here is saying is that as long as when we say it has to be depleted, it doesn't mean depleted like in your backyard. It means depleted in the whole region. As long as there are dates in Yehuda. If you live in Judea, if you live in Yehuda, and there's dates, across Judea, it's far, an hour or whatever, but as long as there's dates over there, that's fine. That's considered like there's still dates over there. If it's another region, that's already too far. Okay, so when we say there's supposed to be dates there, it has to be in that region. Okay, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says. Nun Beis Beis Ochlan al Shel Bein Hakifin. He says that when we assess if there's still dates, we go as long as there are dates between the palm branches, right? Dates grow on palm trees, right? So as long as they're still between the palm branches, Vein Ochlan al Shebein Hashitzin. Okay, and we don't eat based on the availability of those stuck between the thorns. Okay, so what this means is that there at the top of the date tree, there are thorns, okay, and sometimes there might be some dates based on the wind that get stuck between the thorns, okay? So when we say you have to have dates in the field, so he's saying it has to be accessible. It has to be accessible. So as long as they're between the leaves, then an animal can reach it, a person can reach it. It's high, but an animal can reach it. They could get it, no problem. But if it's between the thorns, no one wants to get dates between the thorns, and therefore he says, as long as it's between the thorns, then you would not be able to. Then it's considered as if it's gone, because between the thorns, even though it's there, I could see it, and I might be able to use like a long toothpick or something to get it out. No one's doing that, and therefore it's already considered as if it's done. That is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah. Because what does Rabbi Yehuda say? Rabbi Yehuda says, go and get them from the field. But if you practically can't get them from the field because they're stuck between the thorns, it's as if it's done. So the Tanakh of Mishnah is saying that even if it's in the thorns, it's not considered done, because I see dates over there. Someone's going to get it eventually. Some creature is going to go in between the thorns and get it, and therefore as long as it's there, then we consider it as if it's as if there's still dates over there. And Yehuda says no. If it's between the thorns, even if I see it, since I can't get it practically, therefore it's as if it's done. And then Rabbi Yehuda would hold in that case that you'd have to do beer in that case, you have to get rid of your produce in that case, and that's the machlokes in our Mishnah. Okay, well tomorrow we'll wrap up some of the discussion of beer, but let's just quickly talk about a person traveling from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz, second day Yom Tov. So I do want to mention, although I mentioned yesterday, and I'll reiterate, that the normative psak is that a person from Eretz Yisrael has to keep all of everything. That said, there is a minority view that says that in Tzina, in private, the person will be allowed to do what they want to do. Okay, so if you see someone on their phone or whatever it is doing certain things, there is what to rely upon. Again, it is not the normative halacha, but there is a lenient view that says that as long as it's done b'tzina, then it is permitted. And all these stories that we said before, they excommunicate, again, pretty harsh. They excommunicated him. It wasn't like they said, oh, bad, slap him on the wrist. They excommunicated a person who did this. Those were all cases of public desecration, but if it's done behind closed doors, there is what to rely upon. That's point number one. Second, even within the normative view, which says you can't do anything in public, Rav Moshe Feinstein has a tshuva where he says there's really three things that he says are permitted. These are things where it's quick. It's quick. Two things, really two categories. He says muksa. He says if a person's carrying muksa, it would be allowed. Okay, he says they're allowed to carry muksa. Okay, so a person has their phone, let's say, meaning this comes up, a person wants to travel outside of the tchum, let's say, so some, whatever, let's say they need to travel outside the tchum, so for them to go ahead and put their phone in their pocket, that would be allowed. Okay, he has a whole reason why. The other two things he says is turning on a light or lighting a match would be allowed. Why? Because he says that those things, you walk into a room and the light's on, say, oh yeah, it was on before Shabbos, there was a Shabbos clock, whatever it is, it's something like the flame, you see a flame on, okay, it was before Shabbos, you don't think it was new. And therefore, if it's done, he says again, Rav Moshe says B'tzina, he can't sit there and watch TV and whatever it is, B'tzina in private. But to go ahead and turn on a light, turn off a light, that's something that'll be allowed because in B'tzina, again in private, because if someone walks in and sees it, like, oh, it was done before Shabbos, and that would therefore be allowed. So again, turning on a light or turning on a match, lighting a fire, according to Rav Moshe, would be allowed. Carrying muksa would be allowed, but other things, generally speaking, the vast majority of poskim would say a person from Eretz Yisrael in Chutz La'aretz, as long as they are within the Yishuv, not Bamidbar, not in the desert, not in North Oaks. But the point is, as long as they are within the community, they are not allowed to do anything on the second of Yom Tov, even though back at home they would be. Have a great day.